He never saw his mother's face again. He had traveled halfway around the world. He had survived the jungles of New Guinea. He had survived the fanatical charges of the Japanese Imperial Army. He had unloaded ships while enemy planes screamed overhead. He had won the Good War. He had earned the Good Conduct Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. He was 26 years old, strong, healthy, and wearing the crisp khaki uniform of a sergeant in the United States Army. He was coming home to be hugged. He was coming home to start his life. He was 3 hours away from his front door. But Isaac Woodard would never make it home. Not the way he left. Instead of a hero's welcome, he found a dark alley in a small South Carolina town. Instead of gratitude, he found the cold, hard wood of a police nightstick. And instead of the bright future he had fought for, he found permanent, agonizing darkness. On the night of February 12th, 1946, a police chief named Linwood Shull didn't just beat a black man. He gouged the eyes out of an American soldier. He did it because the soldier dared to ask a question. He did it because the soldier dared to wear a uniform that commanded respect. He did it because, in the eyes of the Jim Crow South, a black hero was more dangerous than a Nazi. This is the story that terrified America. It is the story that woke up the President of the United States in the middle of the night with cold sweat. It is the story of a blinding so brutal that it forced the nation to open its eyes. But before we step onto that Greyhound bus and take the ride into hell, I have a mission for you. This story was suppressed for decades. The local police tried to hide it. The state tried to ignore it. We are bringing it to the light. I want to know where you are watching from today. Whether you are in Detroit, London, Atlanta, or a small town in the Deep South, drop your city in the comments below. Let's build a global jury for the trial that never really happened. To understand the tragedy of Isaac Woodard, you have to understand the atmosphere of 1946. It was a time of schizophrenia in America. On one hand, the country was drunk on victory. We had defeated Hitler. We had defeated Tojo. We were the superpower of the world. The greatest generation was coming home to build the suburbs and the middle class. But for black veterans, 1946 was the year of the bloody homecoming. Over 1 million African Americans had served in World War II. They had seen the world. They had dated white women in France and England. They had walked into bars in Italy, where they were treated like kings. They had held the power of life and death in their hands. They had realized a fundamental truth. White supremacy is not a law of physics. It is a choice. They returned to the United States with a new swagger. They walked with their shoulders back. They looked people in the eye. They wore their uniforms with pride because the uniform was the proof of their citizenship. It said, "I paid for this country with my blood." And this terrified the white establishment of the South. Senators in Mississippi and governors in Georgia gave speeches warning that these returning Negroes were a threat to the Southern way of life. They were uppity. They needed to be taught a lesson. The Ku Klux Klan saw a black man in a uniform not as a patriot, but as a target. Isaac Woodard was not a radical. He wasn't a political activist. He was just a young man from Fairfield County, South Carolina, who had done his duty. He had served in the 429th Port Battalion. He had worked the docks in the Pacific, doing the heavy, dangerous, unglamorous work of logistics under fire. On February 12, 1946, he was honorably discharged at Camp Gordon in Georgia. It was the best day of his life. He had a check in his pocket. He had his papers. He had his freedom. He went to the bus station in Augusta. He bought a ticket on a Greyhound bus bound for Winnsboro, South Carolina. He was going to see his wife. He was going to see his mother. He climbed aboard the bus, found a seat in the colored section at the back, and settled in. The mood among the black soldiers on the bus was joyous. They were laughing. They were joking. They were going home. But the bus driver was not happy. His name was Alton Blackwell. He was a white man, tired, irritable, and steeped in the racial hierarchy of the time. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw black men laughing. He saw black men happy, and it grated on him. In his world, black men were supposed to be quiet. They were supposed to be invisible. About an hour into the trip, the bus pulled into a small stop. Isaac Woodard needed to use the restroom. It is the most basic human need. He walked up the aisle to the front of the bus. He approached the driver. "Excuse me," Woodard said. "Is there time for me to go use the bathroom?" It was a polite question. It was a reasonable request. But Alton Blackwell didn't hear a request. He heard a challenge. He looked at this tall, strong black man in a sergeant's uniform towering over him, and he felt threatened. "Go sit down, boy," Blackwell snapped. "We ain't got time for you." And here is the moment, the pivot point. Before the war, Isaac Woodard might have said, "Yes, sir," and sat down. He might have held it. He might have swallowed the insult. But Isaac Woodard had spent 15 months in the U.S. Army. He was a non-commissioned officer. He had led men. He had earned the right to be treated with dignity. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply corrected the driver. "I am a man," Woodard said, "not a boy." And then he said something that sealed his fate. "Talk to me like I am talking to you. I am in the uniform of the United States Army." The bus went silent. The white passengers in the front froze. The black passengers in the back held their breath. A black man had just corrected a white man in the Jim Crow South. The driver, Blackwell, was furious. He was shaking with rage. But he knew he couldn't fight Woodard right there. Woodard was bigger than him. So, begrudgingly, he opened the door. "Go ahead then," he spat. "But you better hurry back." Woodard stepped off the bus. He used the restroom. He got back on. He went back to his seat. He thought the incident was over. He thought he had stood his ground and won a small victory for his dignity. He didn't know that Blackwell was plotting. The driver spent the next hour stewing in his anger. He felt humiliated. He felt that a nigger had gotten the better of him. He needed to reassert his power. He needed to bring in the law. The bus rolled through the dark South Carolina countryside. It crossed into Saluda County. It approached the tiny town of Batesburg. Batesburg was a place that barely existed on the map. It was a speed trap, a collection of buildings in the dark. But it had a police force, and the chief of police was a man named Linwood Shull. When the bus pulled into the station at Batesburg, the driver got off immediately. He saw two police officers standing on the sidewalk. Chief Shull and his deputy, Officer Elliot Long. Blackwell walked up to them. He pointed at the bus. "I got a soldier on there who's making trouble," Blackwell lied. "He's drunk. He's disorderly. He's disturbing the peace." It was a lie. Woodard didn't drink. He had been quiet the entire ride. But in 1946, the word of a white bus driver was gospel. The word of a black soldier was noise. Chief Shull hiked up his belt. He tapped his nightstick, a heavy, lead-weighted blackjack. He walked onto the bus. "Come here, boy," he shouted down the aisle. Isaac Woodard stood up. He gathered his bag. He walked to the front. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't staggering. He was confused. "I ain't done nothing wrong," Woodard said. "Get off the bus," Shull ordered. Woodard stepped down onto the pavement. The cool night air hit his face. The bus engine idled. The passengers watched through the windows. Woodard tried to explain. He tried to tell the chief that it was just a misunderstanding about a bathroom break. But Chief Shull wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in submission. "Shut up, nigger," Shull said. And then he struck. He swung his blackjack. It connected with Woodard's head. Woodard staggered, but he was a soldier. His training kicked in. He didn't fall. He grabbed the nightstick. He wrestled it away from the chief. For a split second, the power dynamic flipped. The black sergeant held the weapon. The white chief was disarmed. But then, the deputy drew his gun. "Drop it, or I'll kill you." Woodard dropped the stick. He raised his hands. He surrendered. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. But surrender wasn't enough for Linwood Shull. He had been embarrassed. He had been disarmed by a black man in his own town. "You're coming with us," Shull snarled. They grabbed Woodard by the arms. They dragged him away from the lights of the bus station. They dragged him down a side street toward the jail. The bus driver watched them go. Then he got back in his seat, closed the door, and drove away. He left Isaac Woodard alone in the dark with two men who wanted to destroy him. Woodard looked back at the taillights of the bus fading into the distance. It was the last thing he would ever see clearly. He was being led into an alleyway. The blue wall of silence was closing in. What happened next is a scene from a horror movie, but there were no monsters in masks. There were just lawmen. The alleyway behind the Batesburg jail was not a place of law. It was a place of erasure. It was a narrow, unpaved strip of dirt where the Constitution of the United States held no power. When Chief Linwood Shull and Deputy Elliot Long dragged Sergeant Isaac Woodard into the shadows, they weren't arresting a suspect. They were breaking a man. The physical struggle was brief. Woodard was a strong man, a stevedore who had hauled crates in the Pacific, but he was outnumbered, disoriented, and unarmed. They threw him against the brick wall. They wrenched his arms behind his back. And then the questions began. But they weren't questions designed to elicit facts. They were questions designed to enforce a hierarchy. "Where are you from, nigger?" Shull demanded. "Say 'sir' when you talk to me," he screamed. This was the core of the offense. It wasn't the bathroom break. It wasn't the alleged drunkenness. It was the lack of "sir." It was the fact that a black man in a uniform had dared to speak to a white man as an equal. Shull was determined to beat the "sir" out of him. He was determined to beat the soldier out of him until only the boy remained. Woodard tried to explain. He tried to reason. "I am a veteran," he said. "I am just trying to get home." Shull didn't care about his service. To Shull, the uniform was an aggravation. It was a costume that this black man had no right to wear. The blackjack is a terrifying weapon. It is a leather pouch filled with lead shot attached to a flexible handle. It doesn't cut the skin like a knife. It crushes the tissue beneath it. It delivers a concussive force that liquefies muscle and fractures bone without necessarily breaking the surface. Shull began to swing. He hit Woodard in the ribs. He hit him in the shoulders. He hit him in the knees. Woodard crumpled to the dirt. He tried to cover his head, curling into a fetal position, the instinctive defense of a man being murdered. But Shull wasn't done. He wanted to inflict a specific kind of damage. He wanted to take away Woodard's ability to look back. While Woodard was on the ground, Chief Shull gripped his nightstick like a spear. He didn't swing it. He thrust it. He drove the end of the baton directly into Isaac Woodard's eyes. First the left, then the right. The pain was beyond description. It was a blinding, searing flash of white light, followed by an explosion of pressure. The globe of the eye is resilient, but it cannot withstand the driving force of lead and wood. The structure of Woodard's eyes collapsed. The optic nerves, the delicate cables that connect the world to the brain, were severed or crushed. Isaac Woodard screamed. It was a sound that should have woken the entire town of Batesburg. But Batesburg was a town that knew how to sleep through the screams of black men. The windows stayed shut. The lights stayed off. The blue wall held firm. After the blinding, Shull dragged the semi-conscious sergeant into the jail. He threw him into a cell and locked the door. "You sit there and cool off," Shull said. Then he walked away. He went home. He washed his hands. He probably ate a late dinner. He slept the sleep of a man who believed he had done his job. He had restored order. He had put the uppity soldier back in his place. In the cell, Isaac Woodard lay on the concrete floor. The world was spinning. His head felt like it had been split open with an axe. He touched his face. It was swollen, wet with blood and fluid. He tried to open his eyes. He couldn't. The eyelids were swollen shut, fused by dried blood. But even behind the lids, there was no light. There was no shape. There was only a throbbing, red-black void. He didn't know yet that he was blind. He thought it was just the swelling. He thought that if he could just wash his face, if he could just get some ice, the vision would return. He sat in the dark, shivering in the cold February air, waiting for the morning. He thought about his mother in Winsboro. She was waiting for him. The bus had arrived hours ago. She must be pacing the floor. She must be worried. He wanted to tell her he was okay. He wanted to tell her he was almost home. He drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain in his head was a rhythmic hammer. Thump, thump, thump. Morning came, or at least the time for morning came. In the cell, nothing changed. The darkness remained absolute. The door opened. Someone shouted, "Get up!" Woodard struggled to his feet. He reached out for the wall to steady himself. He couldn't see the door. He couldn't see the guard. "I can't see," Woodard said. His voice was a croak. "I can't see." The guard ignored him. "Come on, you're going to the judge." They led him out. Woodard stumbled. He bumped into door frames. He had to be guided like a child. They took him to the local courthouse, a room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. They stood him in front of the judge. The judge looked at the man before him. He saw a U.S. Army sergeant. His uniform was covered in dirt and blood. His face was a mask of bruising. His eyes were swollen shut. A decent human being would have asked, "What happened to this man?" "Call a doctor." But this was a Jim Crow court. The judge didn't see a victim of torture. He saw a defendant. Chief Shull testified. He told the court that Woodard had been drunk, profane, and violent. He claimed he had used necessary force to subdue him. He lied with the ease of a man who knows he will never be cross-examined. Woodard tried to speak. He tried to say, "I wasn't drunk. I just wanted to pee." But his words were slurred from the brain trauma. He was disoriented. The judge banged his gavel. "Guilty." He sentenced Isaac Woodard to a fine of $50 or 30 days on the chain gang. $50. It was almost all the money Woodard had left from his muster-out pay. He fumbled in his pockets. He pulled out the cash. He handed it over to the voices in the dark. The court took his money. And then they pushed him out the door. They didn't call him a cab. They didn't take him to the hospital. They threw a blind, concussed man out onto the street in a strange town and told him to get lost. This is the moment of peak cruelty. The beating was rage. The trial was corruption. But turning him loose was indifference. It was a statement that his life had zero value. Woodard stumbled down the street. He felt the sun on his skin, but he couldn't see it. He was terrified. He was a blind black man in a white town in South Carolina. One wrong step, one bump into a white woman, and he would be lynched. He eventually found his way back to the vicinity of the bus station, or perhaps he was guided there by a passerby who had a shred of pity. But the bus was gone. The world had moved on. For 2 days, Isaac Woodard was lost in the system. The details of these 48 hours are hazy, a nightmare of confusion. Eventually, a doctor was called. Not a specialist, but a local physician who looked at Woodard's eyes and realized the damage was catastrophic. They realized they couldn't just leave him there. A dead soldier on the streets of Batesburg would be messy. A blind soldier was a liability. So the authorities contacted the Veterans Administration. Woodard was transported to the U.S. Army Hospital in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It was there, in a sterile examination room, that the final verdict was delivered. An ophthalmologist examined him. He peeled back the swollen lids. He shone a light into the pupils. There was no reaction. The corneas were clouded. The internal structures were pulverized. The doctor put down his light. He cleared his throat. "Sergeant," he said, "you are blind." "For how long?" Woodard asked. "Forever," the doctor said. "You will never see again." Silence filled the room. Isaac Woodard was 27 years old. 3 days ago, he had been a healthy young man with a whole life ahead of him. He had survived the Japanese snipers. He had survived the malaria. And now, because he had asked a bus driver a question, his world was erased. He would never see his wife's face again. He would never see the children he hoped to have. He would never see the sun rise. He broke down. He wept. Not just for his eyes, but for the betrayal. He had loved his country. He had worn its uniform, and his country had taken his sight. His family in Winsboro still didn't know where he was. They had been waiting at the bus station for days. Finally, weeks later, they found him in the hospital. When his mother walked into the room and saw him, his face sunken, his eyes covered in bandages, his spirit broken, she screamed. It was a scream of primal grief. She didn't recognize her own son. The vibrant, strong soldier she had sent off to war had been returned to her as a broken shell. She took him home. Isaac Woodard sat in his mother's house in the dark. He fell into a deep depression. He refused to leave his room. He was ashamed. He felt that he had failed. He felt that he was a burden. The town of Batesburg went back to normal. Chief Shull patrolled the streets, twirling his blackjack. The bus driver kept driving his route. The judge kept issuing fines. They thought the incident was over. They thought it was just another nigger handling. They thought Isaac Woodard would just fade away into the darkness they had created for him. They were wrong, because while Isaac Woodard couldn't see, he could still speak, and his story was about to escape the small town of Batesburg. It was about to travel north to New York City and land on the desk of the most powerful black organization in America, the NAACP. They were looking for a case. They were looking for a spark. And in the blinded eyes of Sergeant Woodard, they found a fire that would burn down the facade of American justice. Secrets in the Jim Crow South were usually buried deep. They were buried in unmarked graves, in falsified police reports, and in the terrified silence of the black community. The blinding of Isaac Woodard was supposed to be one of those secrets. Chief Shull counted on it. He counted on the fact that Woodard was poor, black, and broken. He counted on the fact that the world didn't care about what happened in the back alley of a town that barely appeared on the map. But Shull made a miscalculation. He forgot that Isaac Woodard was a soldier, and soldiers belong to a brotherhood that spans the nation. Word began to travel. It started in the black hospitals. It moved to the black churches. And finally, it reached the desk of Walter White in New York City. Walter White was the executive secretary of the NAACP. He was a man who had spent his life investigating lynchings. He had walked through the charred remains of race riots. He thought he had seen everything. But when he heard the affidavit of Isaac Woodard, sworn to in a Bronx hospital room where Woodard had moved to live with his sisters, White was shaken to his core. The brutality was so specific, so medieval. The gouging of the eyes, the betrayal of the uniform. White realized that this wasn't just a crime, it was a symbol. It was the perfect, horrific illustration of the bloody homecoming. He decided to make Isaac Woodard the face of the American conscience. The NAACP went to work. They contacted the press. They organized legal defense funds. But they needed a megaphone. They needed a voice that could reach white America, a voice that couldn't be ignored. they found the loudest voice on Earth. Orson Welles. In 1946, Orson Welles was not just a filmmaker, he was a radio god. His voice, deep, authoritative, mesmerizing, reached millions of households every week. He was the man who had terrified the nation with the War of the Worlds. Now, he was about to terrify them with the truth. Welles took up the cause with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. On his weekly radio show, he didn't just report the news. He preached. He told the story of the blinding. He described the nightstick. He described the jail cell. But he didn't know the name of the police officer. The Batesburg authorities were stonewalling. They refused to release the name of the chief. So, Welles created a character. He called him Officer X. For 5 consecutive weeks, Orson Welles waged a psychological war against Linwood Shull over the airwaves. Imagine sitting in your living room in South Carolina, turning on the radio, and hearing the most famous voice in America speaking directly to you. Officer X, Welles rumbled, I am talking to you. You are listening to this, aren't you? You know who you are. We know what you did, and we are coming for you. It was a manhunt by microphone. Welles promised to unmask the monster. He shamed the South. He shamed the Justice Department. He asked the listeners, is this the America we fought for? Is this the justice of the victor? The pressure was immense. The city of Batesburg was besieged by reporters. The blue wall of silence began to crack under the weight of national scrutiny. Finally, the name leaked out. Linwood Shull, the chief of police. Welles broadcast the name to the world. He stripped away Shull's anonymity. He made him the most hated man in Black America and a pariah to liberals in the North. While Welles dominated the airwaves, the black community mobilized on the ground. In August 1946, a massive benefit concert was held at Louis-Own Stadium in Harlem. It was called the Blind Soldier Rally. 20,000 people packed the stands. It was a sea of faces, black, white, famous, and poor. The lineup was a who's who of American culture. Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world, was there. He was the symbol of black strength. When he stood next to the blind, frail figure of Isaac Woodard, the crowd wept. It was the contrast between what black men could be and what America did to them. Woody Guthrie wrote a song about it, The Blinding of Isaac Woodard. It's now you've heard my story. There's one thing I can't see. How you could treat a human being as you have treated me. The rally raised thousands of dollars for Woodard. It bought him a house. It gave him a pension that the Army was slow to provide. But more importantly, it proved that he was not alone. The crowd roared their support. They screamed for justice. It was a precursor to the mass rallies of the 1960s, a demonstration of the power of collective outrage. But the most important audience for this story wasn't in Harlem. It was in the Oval Office. President Harry S. Truman is often remembered as a plain-spoken man from Missouri. He grew up in a state with a strong Confederate heritage. His ancestors had owned slaves. He used racial slurs in private. By all accounts, he should have been indifferent to the plight of a black sergeant. But Truman was also a veteran. He had served as an artillery officer in World War I. He revered the uniform. He believed in the chain of command and the sanctity of the soldier's duty. When Walter White of the NAACP met with Truman in the White House, in September 1946, he laid out the facts of the bloody homecoming. He told him about the lynchings in Georgia, and he told him about Isaac Woodard. He told the president how Shull had driven the baton into Woodard's eyes. Truman was physically sickened. He turned pale. He stood up and exclaimed, "My God." I had no idea it was as terrible as that. We have got to do something. For Truman, this wasn't about civil rights theory. It was about honor. The United States government had drafted Isaac Woodard. It had put him in harm's way, and it had failed to protect him when he came home. Truman viewed the attack on Woodard as an attack on the federal government itself. A local sheriff had tortured a federal soldier. That was insubordination. Truman acted. He did something that no president since Lincoln had dared to do. He bypassed Congress. He bypassed the Southern Democrats who controlled the Senate. He ordered the Department of Justice to investigate. He ordered the FBI to go to South Carolina. This was a seismic shift. For 70 years, the federal government had turned a blind eye to Southern violence. States' rights was the shield that protected lynchers. Truman smashed that shield. He told the FBI to find Linwood Shull and charge him with a federal crime. The FBI agents descended on Batesburg. They were J. Edgar Hoover's G-men, wearing suits and fedoras, walking into a town that viewed them as foreign invaders. They interviewed witnesses. They reconstructed the crime. They found the bus driver, Alton Blackwell, who admitted he had called the police. They found the deputy who witnessed the beating. They built a case. But here was the catch. Murder and assault were state crimes, not federal crimes. The federal government had no jurisdiction over a local assault unless it violated a federal right. So, the Department of Justice got creative. They charged Linwood Shull with violating Section 52 of the U.S. Code, depriving a citizen of his civil rights under color of law. They argued that, by beating and blinding Woodard without a trial, Shull had deprived him of his Fourth Amendment right to be secure in his person and his Fifth Amendment right to due process. It was a bold legal strategy. It was the first time the federal government had tried to use this law to prosecute a white officer for assaulting a black man in the Deep South. The stage was set for the trial of the century in South Carolina. The Department of Justice sent its best lawyers. The nation watched. The black press treated it like the Super Bowl of justice. Everyone believed that with the evidence, with the president's backing, with the eyes of the world on Batesburg, justice would finally be served. Isaac Woodard, guided by his family, traveled back to South Carolina for the trial. He sat in the courtroom, wearing dark glasses to hide the ruin of his face. He listened to the voices of the men who had destroyed him. He couldn't see the jury. He couldn't see the judge. But he could feel the hate in the room. The courtroom in Columbia, South Carolina, was packed. The white spectators sat in the main rows, glaring at the federal prosecutors. They viewed Shull not as a criminal, but as a defender of their way of life. They saw the trial as Northern aggression. Chief Shull took the stand. He didn't deny hitting Woodard. He admitted it, but he claimed self-defense. He claimed Woodard was reaching for a gun Woodard didn't have. He played the victim. "I was just doing my duty," he said. "I was protecting the town." His lawyer, a prominent local politician, didn't argue the law. He argued race. He shouted racial slurs in the courtroom. He told the jury that if they convicted Shull, they would be surrendering the South to the NAACP. He turned the trial into a referendum on white supremacy. "If you rule against this man," the defense attorney thundered, "you are ruling against the South." The federal prosecutors presented a clean, logical case. They showed that Woodard was unarmed. They showed the severity of the injuries. They showed that Shull had admitted to the FBI that he struck Woodard. But in 1946 South Carolina, facts were secondary to feelings. The jury was composed of 12 white men. They listened to the testimony. They looked at the blind soldier. They looked at the white chief. They deliberated for less than 30 minutes. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreman stood up. He didn't look at Isaac Woodard. He looked at the judge. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers. The white spectators applauded. Chief Shull smiled. He shook hands with the jurors. He walked out of the courthouse a free man. Isaac Woodard sat in silence. He wasn't surprised. He knew where he was. He knew that in the South, a white man could kill a black man in broad daylight and call it a public service. But while Scholl won the battle, he had lost the war. The verdict shocked the nation. It shocked President Truman. When Truman heard that a federal jury had acquitted a man who admitted to blinding a soldier, he was furious. "It is my duty to see that the laws are executed," he reportedly said, "and I cannot do it with these people." The acquittal of Linwood Scholl was the final straw. It proved that the legal system in the South was broken beyond repair. It proved that states' rights was just a cover for state-sponsored terrorism. Truman decided to go nuclear. In December 1946, he established the President's Committee on Civil Rights. He gave them a mandate to investigate the condition of Black America and recommend federal laws to fix it. This committee produced a report titled "To Secure These Rights." It was a revolutionary document. It called for a federal anti-lynching law. It called for the end of poll taxes. It called for a permanent civil rights division in the Justice Department. And, most famously, it called for the desegregation of the armed forces. Truman read the report. His advisors told him to bury it. They said it would destroy the Democratic Party. They said the South would revolt. Truman looked at the photo of Isaac Woodard. He thought about the soldier who couldn't see. "I am going to do it," Truman said. "I don't care if it loses me the election. It is the right thing to do." In July 1948, Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981. It declared, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." With the stroke of a pen, the segregated military was dead. It didn't happen overnight. It took years to implement. But the order was given. The Buffalo Soldiers, the Harlem Hellfighters, the Tuskegee Airmen, they had all fought for this moment. But it was the sacrifice of Isaac Woodard, the man who lost his eyes, that finally forced the president's hand. His blindness gave the nation sight. But what of the man himself? While history was being made in Washington, Isaac Woodard was living in the dark in New York. The money from the fundraiser ran out. The fame faded. Orson Welles moved on to other causes. Woodard lived a quiet, lonely life. He learned Braille. He lived with his family. He never regained his sight. He died in 1992, at the age of 73, largely forgotten by the country he had changed. But the story doesn't end in the dark. Because stories like this have a way of resurfacing when the world needs them most. The spotlight of history is fickle. It shines with blinding intensity for a moment, and then it moves on, leaving the protagonists in the dark. For Isaac Woodard, the darkness was literal and eternal. After the trial in 1946, after the rallies in Harlem, after the president's anger cooled, Isaac Woodard went home to the Bronx. He was 27 years old. He would live for another 46 years, but he would never see a sunrise, a smile, or the face of the country he changed. He lived a quiet life. He didn't become a professional activist. He didn't run for office. He lived with his sisters, navigating a world of shadows. He learned Braille. He listened to the radio. He grew old. To his neighbors in New York, he was just a blind man with a gentle spirit. They didn't know that the sunglasses he wore hid the scars that had rewritten the U.S. Constitution. Meanwhile, back in Batesburg, South Carolina, Linwood Scholl lived in the light. The man who had gouged out a soldier's eyes suffered no consequences. He wasn't fired. He wasn't shunned. In the twisted morality of the Jim Crow South, he was a man who had held the line. He lived out his life as a respected member of the community. He died in 1997 at the age of 95, surrounded by family, having never spent a day in jail for his crime. He took his secrets and his lack of remorse to the grave. It seemed like the villain had won. It seemed like evil had triumphed. But history plays a long game. And the trial of Linwood Shull had planted a seed in the unlikeliest of places, the heart of the presiding judge. His name was J. Waddies Waring. Judge Waring was a blue blood of Charleston society. He was an eighth-generation South Carolinian. His father had fought for the Confederacy. He lived in a mansion, belonged to the exclusive white clubs, and had spent his life upholding the segregationist order. When the Department of Justice brought the Woodard case into his courtroom, everyone expected him to be a reliable guardian of the status quo. They expected him to help the local boys sweep this ugly incident under the rug. But Waddies Waring saw something in that courtroom that broke him. He sat on the bench and looked at Isaac Woodard. He saw the ruined face. He saw the dignity of the soldier. And then he looked at Linwood Shull. He saw the arrogance. He saw the smirk of a man who believed he was above the law because of his race. And then, Waring listened to the defense attorney scream racial slurs. He watched the all-white jury laugh and joke with the defendant. When the verdict of not guilty was read, the courtroom cheered. But Judge Waring didn't cheer. He went back to his chambers, and he felt a physical sickness. He realized that his courtroom had been used as a tool of terror. He realized that Southern justice was an oxymoron. That night, something died in Waddies Waring, and something new was born. He began to read. He read Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma. He read about the psychology of racism. He began to invite black activists to his home, a social crime in Charleston that resulted in bricks being thrown through his windows and a cross burned on his lawn. The acquittal of Linwood Shull radicalized a federal judge. Waring decided that if the jury wouldn't do justice, he would. In the years following the Woodard trial, Judge Waring went on a judicial rampage against white supremacy. In 1947, he ruled that the white primary, the system that prevented black people from voting in the only elections that mattered in the South, was unconstitutional. He opened the voting booths to black South Carolinians for the first time since Reconstruction. "It is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union," he famously declared, but his biggest blow was yet to come. In 1951, a case came before him called Briggs versus Elliott. It was a lawsuit challenging the segregation of public schools in Clarendon County, South Carolina. The standard legal doctrine of the time was Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Courts would usually rule that black schools just needed more funding to be equal. Waring rejected that. He pushed the NAACP lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, to attack segregation itself. He told Marshall, "I don't want to litigate how many bricks are in the schoolhouse. I want to litigate the Constitution." When the case was decided, Waring was outvoted by two other judges who upheld segregation. But Waring wrote a dissenting opinion, and in that dissent, he wrote 4 words that would change the world. Segregation is per se inequality. He argued that you cannot separate people by race without branding one group as inferior. Therefore, segregation was unconstitutional. 3 years later, the Supreme Court of the United States took up the case under the name Brown versus Board of Education. When they issued their unanimous ruling outlawing segregation in schools, they didn't write new logic. They adopted Judge Waring's dissent, almost word for word. Think about the chain reaction. Linwood Shull blinded Isaac Woodard. The injustice of that blinding horrified Judge Waddies Waring. Judge Waring wrote the legal argument that killed segregation. Isaac Woodard lost his eyes, but his sacrifice gave the American legal system the vision it needed to see the truth. The baton that crushed his skull also smashed the foundation of Jim Crow. But Woodard didn't know this. He was living in the Bronx, listening to the news on the radio. He heard about Brown versus Board. He heard about the Civil Rights Act. Did he know he was the butterfly whose wings caused the hurricane? We can hope he did. But the world had largely forgotten him. By the 1980s and 90s, the name Isaac Woodard was known only to historians. The town of Batesburg had buried the story. The plaque on the police station listed the names of officers who died in the line of duty, but it said nothing about the soldier who was tortured in the alley. In 1992, Isaac Woodard died. He was buried in the Calverton National Cemetery in New York, a simple soldier's grave. The story was sleeping, but it wasn't dead. In 2011, a new figure entered the story: Richard Gurgle. Richard Gurgle was a United States District Judge in South Carolina. He sat in the very same courthouse where Judge Waring had presided. One night, Gurgle was reading a book about President Truman and came across a brief mention of a blinded sergeant named Isaac Woodard, whose story had enraged the president. Judge Gurgle had lived in South Carolina for years. He was a student of history, but he had never heard of Isaac Woodard. He was shocked. How could a case that changed the presidency and the Constitution be completely unknown in the state where it happened? Gurgle began to dig. He went into the archives of his own courthouse. He found the old transcripts of the 1946 trial. He blew the dust off the files that Waddies Waring had held in his hands. He read the testimony of Linwood Shull. He read the lies. He read the tragedy. And then he did something extraordinary. He decided to write a book. It was called Unexampled Courage. Gurgle's book, published in 2019, hit the state like a bomb. It laid out the direct connection between the blinding of Woodard and the end of segregation. It forced South Carolina to look in the mirror. The people of Batesburg-Leesville, the towns had merged, read the book. They were horrified. A new generation of town leaders, black and white, realized that their town was the site of a historic atrocity, and they had done nothing to acknowledge it. They decided to break the silence. The mayor of Batesburg, a white man named Lantry B. Mowers, reached out to the Woodard family. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't talk about heritage. He talked about atonement. "We need to fix this," he said. They planned a ceremony. They planned to erect a historical marker, not in a cemetery, but right there in the downtown, at the site of the old bus station where the nightmare began. But they wanted to do more than just put up a metal sign. They wanted to tackle the legacy of the blinding head-on. In 2018, something even more powerful happened. A federal judge, Judge Gurgle, and the town leaders tracked down the surviving records of the case. They located the specific alleyway. They located the jail cell, and they found the family. Isaac Woodard had no children, but his nephew, Robert Young, was alive. Robert had cared for his uncle in his final years. He knew the pain Isaac lived with. He knew how Isaac would sit in his chair, rubbing his forehead where the headaches never stopped. When the town of Batesburg called Robert Young and said, "We want to apologize," Robert was skeptical. He had heard apologies before, but he agreed to come down. The stage was set for a confrontation between the past and the present. The family of the victim was coming back to the scene of the crime. February 9th, 2019. A Saturday morning in Batesburg-Leesville, South Carolina. The corner of West Church Street and North Oak Street looks like any other intersection in a small southern town. There is a brick building. There is a stop sign. There is the quiet hum of traffic. For 73 years, this corner was anonymous. People walked past it on their way to the grocery store. Children rode their bikes over the pavement. It was just a patch of concrete, but for the Woodard family, this corner was a graveyard. It was the place where a bus stopped, a nightstick swung, and a life ended. It was ground zero. On this morning, however, the intersection was closed. A crowd had gathered. There were hundreds of people, black and white, young and old. There were television cameras. There were state troopers in dress uniforms. And standing in the front row, looking at a veiled object draped in black cloth, was Robert Young. Robert was Isaac Woodard's nephew. He was the man who had cared for the blinded sergeant in the Bronx. He remembered the smell of the medicine in Isaac's room. He remembered the way Isaac would tilt his head to listen to the radio, his dark glasses reflecting a world he could no longer see. Robert had lived with the trauma of his uncle's blinding every day of his life. When the town of Batesburg invited him to the ceremony, Robert was wary. He knew the history of South Carolina. He knew that for decades, the town had protected Linwood Shoal. He expected a token gesture, a small plaque hidden in a park, a "mistakes were made" speech. What he got was a reckoning. The ceremony began with a prayer. Then, the speakers took the podium. They weren't just activists, they were the establishment. The mayor of Batesburg, Lantry Mowers, stood up. He was a white man representing the institution that had employed Linwood Shoal. He didn't mince words. He didn't talk about both sides. He looked at the Woodard family and he apologized. He admitted that the police force of 1946 had acted as a gang of thugs. He claimed the shame of his town. "We are sorry," he said. "We cannot change the past, but we can tell the truth about it." Then came Judge Richard Gurgle. Gurgle wasn't there just as an author. He was there as a United States District Judge. He wore his robe. He brought the authority of the federal government with him. When he spoke, it was as if the courtroom of 1946 had been reopened. Gurgle recounted the trial. He listed the lies of the defense. He described the laughter of the all-white jury. He dismantled the verdict of not guilty piece by piece, using the evidence of history. He turned to Robert Young. "Your uncle was a hero," Gurgle said. "He was a patriot, and he was the victim of a monstrous crime." In that moment, on that street corner, the legal record was spiritually corrected. A federal judge had publicly declared Linwood Shoal guilty and Isaac Woodard innocent. It wasn't a legal conviction. Shoal was long dead, but it was a moral verdict that echoed louder than the gavel of 1946. And then they unveiled the marker. It is a heavy iron sign, painted black with silver lettering. It stands tall on a post, right next to the old site of the police station. The text on the marker is brutal in its honesty. It does not use euphemisms. It reads, "On February 12, 1946, Sergeant Isaac Woodard, a decorated WA-2 veteran, was removed from a Greyhound bus. He was beaten and blinded by Batesburg Police Chief Linwood Shoal. It names the killer. It names the crime. It cements the truth into the landscape of the town." But there is one detail on that marker that breaks the heart of everyone who sees it. At the bottom of the text, beneath the history of the trial and the impact on the civil rights movement, there is a panel of raised dots. Braille. The town of Batesburg included the entire text of the marker in Braille. Why? Isaac Woodard was dead. He would never read it. He would never run his fingers over the metal and feel the vindication. The Braille wasn't for Isaac. It was for us. It was a symbol of the darkness he was forced to live in. It was a statement that even though he was blind, his story would now be visible to everyone, forever. It was a gesture of profound, belated intimacy, a way of speaking to the dead man in the only language he had left. Robert Young walked up to the marker. He touched the Braille. He wept. He later said, "I wish he could have been here. I wish he could have heard them say they were sorry." The ceremony in Batesburg did something rare in American history. It didn't erase the crime. It acknowledged it. By putting the marker in the center of town, Batesburg admitted that its identity was tied to this atrocity. They stopped hiding, but the story of Isaac Woodard didn't stop at the town limits. The unveiling sparked a new wave of interest. In 2021, the United States Army finally decided to correct its own files. Remember, Isaac Woodard had been discharged hours before the beating. The Army had initially treated his blinding as a civilian matter. They gave him a partial disability pension, but they never formally recognized that his injuries were the result of his service to the nation in a broader sense. He was a soldier, attacked because he was a soldier. The Army couldn't give him his sight back, but they could give him his name back. There is a movement now to name a federal courthouse after Isaac Woodard. There are scholarships in his name. The blind soldier is becoming a figure of national repentance. However, as we look at the marker standing in the South Carolina sun, we have to ask a harder question. Is an apology enough? Linwood Scholl lived to be 95. He died free. He died wealthy. He died unrepentant. The system protected him until his last breath. A plaque in 2019 does not undo the 50 years of freedom Scholl enjoyed while Woodard sat in the dark. This is the asymmetry of justice in America. The victims get monuments. The perpetrators get away. We must also look at the legacy of the blinding in the context of today. When we see videos of police brutality in 2024, when we see unarmed black men beaten or killed during traffic stops, we are seeing the ghost of Linwood Scholl. The uniform changes, the technology changes, dash cams instead of radio shows, but the dynamic remains: authority versus black dignity. Isaac Woodard's crime was not drunkenness. His crime was asserting his manhood. He told the bus driver, "I am a man." That assertion was a capital offense in 1946. Is it still an offense today? The story of Isaac Woodard is a warning. It warns us that the blue wall of silence is real. It warns us that a jury can ignore the truth if the truth makes them uncomfortable. It warns us that rights are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them. But it is also a story of power. Isaac Woodard lost his eyes, but he gained a voice that destroyed Jim Crow. Without his sacrifice, Truman might not have desegregated the military. Without desegregation, the civil rights movement of the 1960s would have looked very different. The integration of the Army created a generation of black men who had been trained to lead and fight. Woodard was the first domino. When he fell, he knocked over the whole rotten structure. As we move to the conclusion of this tragedy, we have to think about the unknown Isaac Woodards. We know his story because Orson Welles picked it up. We know it because the NAACP fought for it. But how many soldiers were pulled off buses in 1946 and killed in the woods, their bodies never found? How many were beaten into silence and never told their story? Isaac Woodard is the representative of the missing. He stands in for every black veteran who came home to a war they didn't sign up for. The marker in Batesburg is a start. But the real monument must be built in our laws and in our conduct. The bus is gone. The witness is alone. And the nightmare begins.